Well, we're starting into the Advent season, and it's been interesting. This week I was doing some research, and I was looking at the question of hope, and discovered that there's been some major research going on over the last few years. It's not spiritual research, it's not Christian research, but it's research that is happening at an intellectual university level, at a business level, and it's all on the idea of how do you help people be hopeful. Because hope and optimism are seen as some of the greatest, most significant character values in the 21st century. I thought, wow, isn't that interesting? Because we're going to be going into, in the new year, the Gospel of Matthew. We're actually starting in this Advent season into the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus reveals the kingdom of hope. And so what he's telling us is that as people who know Jesus, we have something of great value for our culture, for our society. The capacity for hopeful optimism. As we begin this series, we're going to be looking at four significant, in Matthew chapter 1, verse 17. After that long list of genealogy, God inspires Matthew to say, now there were 14 generations from the beginning of the world to Abraham. There were 14 generations from Abraham to David, 14 generations from David to the exile, and 14 generations from the exile to the birth of Christ. So we're going to travel, what's 14 times 4, folks?
56.
Is that 52?
56.
56. See? Well, it's the painkillers, it's the drugs, that's what it is. I'm done with that excuse. That doesn't work anymore. It worked for a few days, but it doesn't work anymore. 56. We're going to travel 56 generations in 4 weeks to get to Christmas Eve and the arrival of Jesus. But we begin with Abraham. And I want to tell you, let's see, 1999, New Year's weekend, 1999, I had just been reading this same passage about Abraham. And I woke up Sunday morning. We had family around for New Year's rather. And I woke up early and I went down and made sure the wood fire was on in the basement of the house we were living in. And we had this big, you know those double papasan basket kind of things? I crawled into my double papasan manger. And I put the TV on, and everybody else was asleep in the house, and the fire was warm, and yeah, I fell asleep. And I woke up to the sound of the phone ringing. And as I picked up the phone, it was one of the deacons from the church that we were part of. And I was working for the convention office, so I knew I had no responsibility Sunday morning, so I had kind of wondered why the guy was calling, but I said, hello? He says, the pastor has laryngitis. Is there any way you could preach on short notice? And I was in such a fog from sleep that I said, sure. I didn't stop to think, well, the associate pastor, have you asked him? Or, well, no room for excuses. I just said, sure. And I hung up the phone. And Marilyn came downstairs. And if you think back, January 2nd, I think it was, 1990, Ben was 14 months old. He had been dealing with a high fever since Christmas. She says, his fever's way up again. We have to go to emergency. And I'm thinking, there goes my sermon preparation time. We zipped off to the hospital, waited through. He was just about the next to go in after an hour, which was a pretty good trip to emergency on a morning morning like that. And I left Marilyn and Benjamin in the hospital, and I headed back to the church to speak on Abraham. Because this is where God had been taking me. Abraham was a man who had three great hopes. More than anything, God had given him a hope of a home. He had called Abraham and Sarah and said, I'm going to take you from where you are, and I'm going to take you to somewhere new where you're going to be at home. And so I figured that was sort of the essence of that message that I would share, that longing for a place to be home, because and that hope. And before I go any further, I want to give you a definition of what hope is to me. Hope is an optimistic, trusting step into the unknown. Hope is saying, I don't know what's ahead, but I can make the step because I hope. I have a reason to be optimistic. I have a reason to trust. The good thing for us as Christians is what we're optimistic about, who we put our trust in, is the God of all eternity. And so he allows us to step into the unknown. Well, that Sunday morning, that was my message to the church. That Abraham was about to go into the unknown, but he was trusting God and he was willing to go. And he was willing to go in hopes of finding a home. It was very personal for me because I was finishing. I knew from God that I was going to be done the work I was doing at the convention. And I knew that somewhere in 1999, we would be packing up, probably leaving our house in Quispamsis and moving to a new home. See, I had had a house for several years. After having that house for 3 or 4 years and having 2 single guys live with me in the house, got reacquainted with Marilyn after 20 years, and we were engaged, and all of a sudden the house began to become a home. It was more than just a roof over our heads. It was a home. And then Benjamin came along a year after that, or a year before that, and house was home. It was a place where I was known and loved and accepted with all of my faults, and where I felt incredibly comfortable with the people around. Aren't those the things that make it home? And Christmas is coming, and this year, Christmas is about getting the children back home. So home means something a little bit different for us this year. And perhaps, I don't know what it means for you this year, but Christmas is always connected to that sense of home. Whether it's you need to travel, or people are traveling, or whether it's home is going to be different this year because it's just different. Or maybe it's home is home, and my sense of home is going to be through the telephone lines as I talk to family far away. It's home. It may be a step into the unknown. But Abraham was willing to take that trusting step because he believed that God promised he would give him a place where he was going to be home. In that home, God had promised that he was going to be a blessing to the entire world. That there would be a child in that home, and from that child there would be a blessing for the entire world. Abraham, Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. Let me read it for you. The Lord God said to Abraham, leave your native country, your relatives, your family, your father's family, and go to a land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who treat you with contempt. And all the families of the earth will be blessed through you. Abraham believed God, and he trusted him. And he took an optimistic, trusting step into the unknown. Because he did, well over 90% of the monotheistic believers in the world trace their faith heritage back to Abraham. Every Muslim, every follower of Judaism, every follower of Christianity traces their roots of faith back to Abraham, who was willing to trust God that God had a home for him. Isn't that amazing? That's absolutely amazing. So Abraham begins the journey. He gets to the land, and there's a challenge. He's now pushing 90. Sarah, his wife, is getting up there too. And there's one thing missing. He doesn't have an heir yet. There's no one to carry on after him. God had been faithful in that first part of the promise. He had brought him to the place where he was to be at home, but his home was kind of like my house on, let's see, 12 Samantha, it was the new address when they changed addresses in Quispamsis. On 12 Samantha in Quispamsis, there was a house. But it took some things for that house to become a home. First of all, I had to get rid of the two other single guys that were living there. And Marilyn came, and it started to feel like a home. And then a year later, Benjamin was born. And I remember the first Christmas, 2 months old. We flourished him with gifts. He's sitting there in the little stroller, in the little chair, with all these gifts around him. And we have the picture. I'm sure he loved Christmas. We loved flourishing him with gifts at Christmas. And when Sarah came along, we loved giving to her at Christmas. And you know what? Maybe that's part of God's character in us, that we love to give. But Abraham didn't have an heir. But God promised him one. Let me see. Genesis 15, verse 4. Then the Lord said, "No, your servant will not be your heir, for you will have a son of your own to be your heir." God had promised. Now, if you are familiar with the story of Abraham and Sarah tried their own way to make God's stuff happen. And in the midst of that, God was still faithful and blessed Ishmael, but the heir was Isaac. Can you imagine how much Abraham and Sarah must have loved Isaac? Their own baby, their first baby. Their heir. The one to whom they were going to be able to pour out all that they had been given. Let me go back to January 2nd, I think it was January 2nd, might have been 3rd, 1999. Well, I was preaching about Abraham and how Abraham was trusting God and he was going to the home. One of the deacons was receiving a phone call at the church. And as soon as the message was done, he said, "Great message, I have a message for you." Marilyn called, Benjamin rushed to the hospital. He had finished the appointment with the doctor had checked them all out in a merge, and the doctor was wrapping up, going to send us home with yet another round of antibiotics, and she went to change his diaper, and she opened the diaper, and it was full of blood. This is my child. This is the one that I want to pour things into to have them carry on. And all of a sudden, there's this unknown risk. And the journey of hope, the optimistic, trusting step forward, meant 2 weeks in the hospital under the care of Dr. Xiao. Funny, 20 years later in his name, 21 years later in his name is right there. Dr. Seattle. And Dr. Seattle cared for Benjamin. We discovered that he had a virus that was starting to attack his kidneys. And he got great care. And as you can see, it has affected him a whole lot. For those of you who do know Ben, but there came that point where I had to be willing to trust. I had to be willing to take a optimistic, trusting step forward that God knew what was best for Ben. Well, you know, God did the same thing with Abraham. Do you remember? Perhaps you remember when Isaac was about 12 years old, they went to make a sacrifice. And they climbed up Mount Moriah. And Isaac, being a curious 12-year-old, said, said, Dad, where's the lamb for the sacrifice? Optimistic, trusting step forward. Abraham said, God will provide. And his unsureness about how God would provide, he followed through on what he thought he needed to do, and he wrapped his son in rope, and he laid him on top of an altar. And I can imagine that Isaac's eyes were about yay big at this point. And a ram is there, caught in some thick brush beside where he built the altar. And God says, don't kill your son. Sacrifice the ram. And I don't know if Abraham looked at his son and said, fooled you. Or what he said. But he had optimistically, trustingly stepped forward with his heir. And in doing that, he gave us our great foreshadowing of what God himself would do for us. He would optimistically, trustingly go to the cross and become the sacrificial lamb for us. We've celebrated that today because he was the heir that was promised. Isaac was the first step, but Jesus was the heir that was promised. Isn't that great news? And, you know, I'm getting to that age where my children are long beyond my control. And several of you are saying, okay, we understand that. Wait till your grandchildren grow up and get beyond your control. But parenting is for those who can optimistically, trustingly move forward into the unknown because their hope is in God. Home is for those who optimistically, trustingly can move forward because their trust is in God. The third thing that Abraham was promised was a heritage, that there would be a heritage. That in him all the nations of the earth would be blessed. Abraham has a third conversation with God, and in chapter 17, verse 7, God says this, I will confirm my covenant with you and your descendants after you, from generation to generation. This is an everlasting covenant. I will always be your God, and the God of your descendants after you. God promised that people would look back and they would see a great heritage that leads back to Abraham. Remember I said that well over 90% of the people who believe that there's one God in control trace their roots back to Abraham? There's a great heritage. And the heritage for us as Christian believers goes back to Abraham, but it finds its roots. It finds its strength. It finds its reason to be optimistic. It finds its place of trust. It finds the ability to step forward while we look back and celebrate. We find our heritage in being Jesus people. Our theme for the whole new year is coming out of Matthew chapter 12, verse 21. His name, in His name, is the hope of the entire world. Abraham's hope was fully fulfilled in Jesus. So, my question in conclusion today is this. It's Christmas time. Lots of time to think about home and about heritage and all those things. Now, it's interesting. We spent some time in Ephesians, and Ephesians was written by the Apostle Paul, and the Apostle Paul never had children of his own. But man, what a heritage. He left a spiritual heritage. We all have the opportunity to leave spiritual heritage. We all have an opportunity to pass on spiritual truth to heirs, whether they are our blood children or just people God brings into our life. We all have the opportunity to move towards home. Maybe not a building built with bricks and mortar, but a place deep in our hearts where God knows our name. He's always glad we came. Where God knows our faults and welcomes us anyway and wants to give us His very best. We have it all because of Jesus. Because hope came down when God became one of us.